In 1925, the United States Army War College issued a study on the military potential of African American soldiers. The study concluded, in language that was openly endorsed by the senior leadership of the Army at the time, that Black Americans lacked the intelligence, the discipline, and the physical courage required for combat aviation. The report was filed. It informed Army personnel policy through the entire interwar period. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, the United States Army Air Forces had no black combat pilots in its operational squadrons. The doctrine that had been written in 1925 was still the doctrine in force. Within 4 years, an all-black fighter group flying P-51 Mustangs from a southern Italian airfield would post one of the best long-range bomber escort records in the 15th Air Force, lose 27 bombers under escort across 179 missions, and force the post-war Army Air Forces and the United States military as a whole to confront the fact that the 1925 doctrine had not been true. The squadron came out of Tuskegee, Alabama. The civilian pilot training program, established in 1939 to expand the American pool of qualified pilots in advance of the war Roosevelt could see coming, had been opened to black college students in 1940 under pressure from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt personally. Mrs. Roosevelt had flown with Charles Alfred Anderson, the chief instructor at the Tuskegee Institute's program, in March 1941, and had subsequently lobbied the president to authorize a fully black flying squadron in the Army Air Forces. The president had authorized it. The Army had complied under protest. The 99th Pursuit Squadron was activated at Chanute Field, Illinois, in March 1941, and moved to Tuskegee Army Air Field in November 1941 for combat training. The men who trained at Tuskegee through 1942, pilots, mechanics, navigators, armorers, and all the supporting specialists a squadron required, included veterans of the civilian pilot training program at Tuskegee Institute and graduates of the historically black colleges of the southern states. They were, on average, better educated than the white pilots of comparable Army Air Forces squadrons. The Army's screening tests had been raised, for the Tuskegee program specifically, to a standard the white pilot programs did not require. The men who passed the screening were among the most academically credentialed flying cadets in the U.S. service. The 99th Pursuit Squadron deployed to North Africa in April 1943, equipped with the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. The deployment was monitored intensively by the White Officer Corps of the U.S. Army Air Forces in the theater. The 12th Air Force commander, Major General Edwin House, attempted to have the 99th withdrawn from combat in the autumn of 1943 on the grounds, formally stated that its combat record was not equivalent to that of comparable white squadrons. The report House submitted formed the basis for a hearing in Washington in October 1943, at which the Deputy Chief of the Army Air Forces, Major General Barney Giles, presented the 12th Air Force's recommendation for withdrawal. The 99th Pursuit Squadron's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., son of the senior black officer in the U.S. Army and himself the first black graduate of West Point in the 20th century, testified at the same hearing. Davis presented the squadron's actual combat statistics. The statistics did not support House's claim. Davis's testimony, supplemented by independent analysis from the Army Air Force's Statistical Control Office, killed the recommendation. The 99th remained in combat. The training at Tuskegee Army Air Field through 1942 and 1943 was conducted under conditions that no white pilot training program in the United States faced. The base itself was located in rural Alabama, surrounded by towns whose municipal segregation ordinances barred Tuskegee's black officers from restaurants, theaters, and most retail establishments. The base's white commanding officer, Colonel Noel Parrish, was an unusual figure in the Army Air Forces of his time, a Texan who had concluded, on the basis of having watched the Tuskegee cadets train, that the institutional resistance to black combat pilots was wrong. Parrish defended his squadrons against the surrounding civilian harassment and against the periodic attempts by senior Army Air Forces officers in Washington to slow the Tuskegee program by reducing its training resources. The cadets who passed through Tuskegee under Parrish remembered him in their post-war oral histories as the white officer who had treated them as airmen rather than as a political problem. He was the exception. Most of the white instructor staff at Tuskegee through 1942 and 1943 had been assigned to the base against their preferences, and had reported up the chain that the cadets they were training were not the equals of comparable white cadets at other bases. The cadets passed their flight tests anyway, at completion rates statistically equivalent to those of white Army Air Force's training programs in the same period. The 99th Pursuit Squadron's first months in North African combat in 1943 were difficult. The squadron was equipped with the Curtiss P-40F Warhawk, a serviceable fighter, but no match for the Bf-109G the Luftwaffe was flying over Tunisia. The 99th's pilots flew ground support and convoy escort missions through the spring and early summer of 1943, slowly accumulating combat hours, but with few opportunities to engage German fighters in air-to-air combat that would have built the squadron's air combat record. On July 2, 1943, in the skies over Sicily, the 99th finally encountered German fighters in numbers and gave the institutional doubters in Washington their first measurable engagement. Lieutenant Charles B. Hall shot down a Focke-Wulf FW-190, the first confirmed aerial kill by an African-American pilot in U.S. combat history. Hall returned to base, was congratulated by his squadron mates, and was given a bottle of Coca-Cola produced by Colonel Parrish from a personal stock. The Coca-Cola became, in the squadron's memory, the symbolic recognition the squadron had been working toward. Hall would later command the 99th himself and retire as a lieutenant colonel. The merger of the four black fighter squadrons into the 332nd Fighter Group in early 1944 brought together approximately 400 pilots, 2,000 ground crew, and a complete operational structure on a single airfield. The 332nd at Ramitelli was, by mid-1944, the largest single concentration of black American military aviation personnel in history to that point. The group's mechanics, many of them graduates of historically black colleges' engineering programs, produced an operational readiness rate on the P-51 Mustang that ran consistently above the 15th Air Force average. The bomber crews of the 5th Bombardment Wing, the 2nd, 97th, 99th, 301st, 463rd, and 483rd Bombardment Groups, all flying B-17s, began requesting Red Tail Escort by name as the spring and summer of 1944 progressed. The request was not a courtesy. The bomber crews had learned mission by mission that the 332nd's pilots did not break off escort to chase individual German fighters for personal kills, as some other 15th Air Force escort groups did. The 332nd's doctrine, set by Davis personally and enforced rigorously through the chain of command, was that the escort stayed with the bombers. The bombers came home. The kill claims could come later. The doctrine cost the 332nd its claim to fame in the wartime kill count statistics. The group ranked in the middle of the 15th Air Force in air-to-air victories because its pilots routinely declined opportunities to engage German fighters in conditions that would have taken them away from the bomber stream. The doctrine produced the escort record that made the group famous. The bomber crews returning from Romania and Austria filed combat reports that mentioned the Red Tails by name, repeatedly. The 15th Air Force Public Affairs Office, alert to the morale value of a black squadron whose record the white bomber crews praised, picked up the story. The Chicago Defender's 1945 article, which produced the Never Lost a Bomber claim, was an extension of this morale-driven publicity that had begun in the Italy theater in 1944. A specific mission catches the texture of the work. On August 24, 1944, the 332nd escorted the 304th Bombardment Wing, about 300 B-17s and B-24s, to the Pardubice airfield in Czechoslovakia, 800 miles from Ramitelli. German fighters intercepted the bomber stream 40 miles short of the target. The 332nd, 3 squadrons, flying P-51DS with full external tanks, engaged the German interceptors in a running fight that lasted approximately 40 minutes. The bomber stream completed its bomb run on Pardubice and turned for home. The 332nd's combat reports for that mission documented 13 confirmed German fighter kills against the loss of 3 Mustangs and no bombers under escort. The bomber stream came home without losses. The mission was logged in the unit war diary as a successful action. It was, by the standards of any escort fighter group in any theater of the war, an exceptional day. It was also, by the 332nd's standards, an ordinary day. The group had been flying missions of that scale, and that result 2 or 3 times a week through the summer. By February 1944, the 99th had been merged with 3 additional black fighter squadrons, the 100th, the 301st and the 302nd, to form the 332nd Fighter Group, transferred to the 15th Air Force in southern Italy and re-equipped first with the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and then with the North American P-51 Mustang. The group's airfield was at Romania, on the Adriatic coast of Italy, about 90 miles southeast of Foggia. The 332nd's mission, beginning in May 1944, was long-range bomber escort for the heavy bombers of the 15th Air Force, B-17s and B-24s flying out of the Foggia airfield complex against targets in Romania, Austria, southern Germany and the Balkans. The standard escort distance was 800 miles one way. The Mustangs flew the round trip with external drop tanks. The missions lasted 6 to 8 hours. The 332nd flew 179 bomber escort missions for the 15th Air Force between June 1944 and April 1945. The group encountered German fighters on 35 of those missions and lost bombers under escort on only 7. The total number of bombers shot down by enemy aircraft while under 332nd escort was 27. The 15th Air Force's average loss figure for the other P-51 escort groups operating the same routes over the same period was approximately 46 bombers per group across a comparable number of missions. The 332nd's loss rate was approximately 58% of the average. The group's own combat losses, Mustangs shot down or destroyed in operational accidents, were 66 pilots killed or missing across the period. The 332nd Fighter Group's record was extraordinary by any operational standard. It was not, however, the record of the popular myth. The 1945 Chicago Defender newspaper article that first claimed publicly that the Tuskegee Airmen had never lost a bomber under escort drew on a 15th Air Force Public Affairs release that had been written for morale purposes, and that had omitted 7 missions on which losses had occurred. The omission was discovered by historians working through the 332nd actual mission reports in the 1990s and was published in a definitive review by the Air Force Historical Research Agency in 2007. The review confirmed that 27 bombers had been lost. The largest single loss was on July 18, 1944, when 15 B-17s of the 483rd Bombardment Group were shot down during an escort mission to Memmingen, Austria, in which the 332nd escort was overwhelmed by a large German interceptor force. The other 6 losses were distributed across the remaining months of the campaign. The 1945 popular claim that no bomber had been lost was wrong. The 332nd actual record, 27 bombers lost across 179 escort missions, against an average of 46 for comparable groups, was the more remarkable record because it was actual. The group had been escorting heavy bombers at the limit of their operational range, against the same Luftwaffe interceptor force the 8th Air Force was facing over Germany at the same time, with the same aircraft, the same fuel limitations, and the same combat conditions. The 332nd's pilots had been told throughout their training that the Army Air Force's senior leadership did not believe they could do the work. They had done the work at a rate that was, by the verified Air Force figures, better than the average of the white groups they flew alongside. The political and institutional consequences were considerable. The 332nd's verified record was filed in the Army Air Force's Statistical Control Office through 1946 and was reviewed in detail by the team that produced the 1948 Report on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Services, the document that would underpin President Truman's Executive Order 9981 desegregating the United States military. The Tuskegee Airmen's combat record was one of the central evidentiary inputs to the desegregation argument. The 1925 War College study, which had insisted that black Americans could not perform combat aviation duties, was not merely contradicted by the 332nd. It was contradicted by a record more impressive than the institutional comparison the 1925 study had taken for granted. Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in July 1948. The United States military, the most institutionally segregated branch of the federal government at the time, began the process of formal desegregation that summer. The chain of reasoning that produced the order ran from the Romania airfield to the White House by way of the Statistical Control Office's combat reports. The men who flew the missions did not, in most cases, become famous in the years after the war. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the commander of the 332nd, continued in the U.S. Air Force after its establishment as a separate service in 1947, and retired in 1970 as a three-star general, the first African American to reach that rank in any branch of the United States military. Charles Magee, who flew 136 combat missions in the P-51 over Italy in 1944 and 1945, more than nearly any other American pilot in the European theater, went on to fly more combat missions in Korea and in Vietnam, for a personal total of 409 combat sorties across 3 wars, before retiring as a colonel and reaching the age of 101. Daniel Chappie James, who had been a Tuskegee instructor in 1943 and 1944, became the first 4-star black general in U.S. military history in 1975. The majority of the Tuskegee Airmen, however, came home from the war and went into the segregated American civilian society of the late 1940s. Many of them ended their careers in middle-grade positions that did not reflect the institutional weight of what they had done in Italy. The 1948 desegregation order opened the military to them. It did not open the rest of American society. The men who flew the 332nd's missions had, by 1955, scattered into ordinary American working lives. The post-war lives of the Tuskegee Airmen included one element that the historians have noted repeatedly. The men who had flown the 332nd's missions came home to an American society that had not changed during their absence. The GI Bill provisions for housing loans, college tuition, and small business financing were administered by local banks and state-level authorities that, in the southern states, applied the bill's benefits selectively to black veterans on a much smaller scale than to white veterans. A 1947 study by the Veterans Administration found that, of the Tuskegee Airmen who had applied for GI Bill housing loans in their home states, fewer than 30% had had their applications approved. The figure for comparable white pilot veterans in the same southern states was over 90%. The men who had flown bomber Escort over the Reich had, in many cases, less practical access to the post-war American economy than the men they had escorted. The contradiction was understood by the Tuskegee Airmen at the time and was discussed in their internal correspondence through the late 1940s and the 1950s. The 1948 desegregation order had opened the military. It had not opened the country. The Tuskegee Airmen, Inc., the Veterans Association, the surviving 332nd pilots organized in 1972, served 3 principal functions through the second half of the 20th century: lobbying for the preservation of Tuskegee Army Air Field as a historic site, supporting black aviation cadets entering the U.S. Air Force Academy and the civilian airline industry, and producing the oral histories and documentary work that has corrected the public record. The Air Force Historical Research Agency's 2007 publication of the corrected Escort record, the Smithsonian's various exhibitions on the group, and the 2012 Hollywood film Red Tails are the public products of that long, careful work. The Tuskegee Airmen's combat record is now, in 2026, one of the better documented and more rigorously analyzed unit records in the U.S. Air Force's institutional history. The figures from Ramitelli are the figures. They were earned 80 years ago. They are what they are. The aircraft they flew survives in restoration. The red-tailed P-51 Mustangs in the Air Force Museum at Dayton, Ohio, and in private restoration hangars across the United States are the Flying Memorial. The 332nd official combat records are at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, about 40 miles down the road from Tuskegee. Every researcher who has worked through those records since the late 1990s has produced the same verdict. The 1925 War College study was wrong. The 332nd Fighter Group's combat record was, by any reasonable comparison, an excellent one. The bomber crews of the 15th Air Force who flew with Red Tail Escort knew it during the war. The post-war historians know it now. The men in the cockpits had been told by their own service that they could not do the work. They had done it at a rate that, on the verified records, ran nearly 2-to-1 better than the institution that had doubted them. The argument was closed in the figures. The figures are still in the archive.